Roy Carter stepped into the still, crisp morning air outside his favorite coffee shop, which was nestled in the northwestern corner of a plaza formed by one of Pittsburgh's most iconic skyscrapers. He had only lived in the city for a short time, having migrated from Texas a few years prior to accept a position as dean of faculty at one of the area's more prestigious private universities. As a man who appreciated the finer things in life, he'd quickly established a daily ritual, walking more than a little out of his way after parking his car each morning to visit the shop. It was a simple, generally unremarkable establishment that survived amid a sea of franchised competitors by providing a uniquely bitter, but ultimately more sophisticated, blend, which its loyal patrons both craved and coveted. Roy stopped, holding his coffee cup at chest height in one hand, and the handles of his elegant attaché case near his side in the other. His eyes were drawn to the ground a few feet in front of him, where an odd stain appeared, indicating that someone had perhaps spilled a measure of some inferior beverage while he'd been inside conducting his business. For a moment, Roy contemplated the scenarios that might have led to the evidence he saw before him. Perhaps, a worker in the building surrounding him, already running late, had made a bad day worse by clumsily losing hold of their cup while making their way inside. A brief vision of a young intern, colliding with another pedestrian while carrying several coffees, destined to be chewed out by someone for failing at their assigned task, half formed in his mind, but Roy quickly dismissed it, concluding that the circumstances of the stain's appearance were ultimately of no consequence to him. He simply moved forward, only diverting his path to ensure that not a single drop of the remaining fluid would find its way onto any part of his freshly polished black Oxfords. As he instinctively returned to the path he normally used to traverse the plaza, the invisible line that represented the most direct route from the coffee shop's entrance to the lobby of the university's administrative building, Roy sighed and shrugged his shoulders slightly, then took a tiny sip of his coffee. In many ways, Roy Carter was a creature of habit. He embraced and was readily soothed by the rituals and traditions of his existence. Roy had spent many years patiently architecting the details of his life into a refined routine that comforted and pleased him. As such, returning to that routine from any deviation, no matter how insignificant, always provided him with a warm, self-assured feeling. In his own estimation, Roy was an important, respected man, with impeccable taste, who had become the proverbial master of all he surveyed. There was a tiny part of him that knew better, that was in fact convinced he was a fraud, who had simply been lucky, or made his own luck at the expense of others to attain his place in the world. Still, like so many in such positions, Roy had long ago learned how to silence, or at least ignore, that particular, nagging aspect of his conscience for the most part. This left him in an almost blissful, sated state when things were going as planned, as they were meant to in his mind. As Roy approached the center of the plaza, he tilted his head back slightly and took in the perfectly blue sky above him, then closed his eyes and breathed in deeply through his nose, catching a slight whiff of the coffee being held just a couple feet away from it. Yes, he thought, all is right with the world. Roy began to move the coffee cup toward his lips as he walked, meaning to take another sip with his eyes closed, to fully appreciate its flavor. Just as his muscles began to respond, an intense flash of light filled the sky. It was so bright that Roy easily perceived it through his closed eyelids, as an equally potent sound immediately deafened him, and a concussive force pushed a wave of hot air down onto him with hurricane-like intensity. The dean staggered forward for a few steps, instinctively dropping the items in his hands and covering his ears as he lowered his head. Roy let his knees bend and his upper body hunched as the last of the artificial wind cascaded onto his back and threatened to send him face down.